Welcome to an episode of Vendict Talks. Today we're diving straight into a topic that's been quietly undermining security teams and vendor relationships. And there's one person who isn't afraid to call out that, and it's our guest, Nate Lee. In one of his recent posts, he's argued that security teams are making their own vendors' security worse without even realizing it. That they're drowning vendors in hundreds of questions without using answers effectively. And even worse, they're forcing vendors to waste time copying and pasting into portals instead of actually securing their platforms. Today, we're going to dig into that post, pull it apart, and find out what's really broken, and more importantly, how we can fix it. So, Nate, welcome to our episode. How are you doing?
Great. Hey, James, how are you?
It's good to see you. I know we have a slight time difference, and I'm pretty sure that you've had your first coffee and ready to dive in, right?
I am indeed ready.
Great. So let's talk about your post on TPRM. It got our attention, and I think it's really struck a chord. So talking about TPRM, third-party risk management, can you talk about specifically the topic, and why do you think it resonated with so many people on LinkedIn?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the vendor side, which from my perspective usually ends up being software vendors, there's just a universal problem of, as you sell to enterprises, you end up getting hit with questionnaires, which I assume you and everybody else is very aware of. You get hit with all these questionnaires, and having kind of lived on that side of the fence for a really long time, seeing the impact that happens, or that has on an organization. If you get 2 or 3 of those a week and it takes 4 hours each time, it's not the most value-adding sort of thing you can be doing for a security program, to be answering the same question over and over and over again, just formatted slightly differently. That's someone who could have been securing the platform, but instead is now answering questions over and over. It's just that because we're coming from 2 different worlds, when you're on an enterprise side and you're trying to assess risk, you don't see the impact that has. And likewise, when you're the vendor, you don't understand what it's like to manage hundreds of vendors, across your organization. So there's just this big divide. There's a big fence, and it's hard for each side to understand the perspective and see the perspective and the effects that the other has on the process.
So is this a communication problem, or is it a process problem?
I think it's a bit of both, because the overall process is clearly broken. It's not solving what it's meant to, but it's also a communication problem, because in most cases there isn't a whole lot of communication. It's, oh, someone in our org wants to buy this software from you. Here's our thing. Fill it out, and then we'll maybe set up a 30-minute meeting to go over your answers, maybe. And that is not really to understand the system necessarily. A lot of times it's just to clarify answers because of ambiguously worded questions, ambiguously worded answers, and just to make sure someone sort of did something, I guess is maybe the best way I can put it.
Fair enough. I agree. We look at this problem in Vendict a lot. So we definitely feel that pain too. You said that customers are making their vendor security programs worse. It was an interesting statement for me. It really stood out. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, and this, I mean, it really does come back to the whole not understanding sort of the effect that sending out all these questionnaires has. And one of the things, like I said, is just if someone's answering all these questions, it's not just your 200 questions, it's everyone else's 200 questions, which probably realistically are very similar to each other. Just one is in Word, one's in Excel, one's in a portal, whatever it might be. So one is, it takes a lot of time away from the team. And if you're dealing with a software vendor who isn't, already in the 2,000 people plus sort of size, you're dealing with a team who's maybe 2, 3, 4 people. And if one of those people's job is solely to answer questions, that's a really significant hit to the actual security program and what they can do to make the platform more secure. So just by the nature of having all of this work, you're taking work away from kind of building out actual controls, monitoring, things like that you want to see in a platform. It's just harder to recognize that, because if you're coming from an enterprise, you're used to, maybe a security team of dozens or potentially hundreds of people, and it just doesn't really click that having someone answer a questionnaire would have such a material effect on the overall security program, but that actually is the case.
So we're looking at those 263 question Excel sheets. They keep happening. So if the process is broken or there is a clear problem, why does it keep happening? Is number one, and is it just security for security's sake or process for process sake? What is happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's grown over time. Like when I look at questionnaires, sometimes I'm just laughing because I'm just like, this clearly was written in the late 90s, and then it's kind of carried forward because it's one of those things, like with regulations or whatever. It's much easier to add than it is to remove from, because no one wants to be the one who removes the question about, do you use USB drives and encrypt them, despite the fact that probably no one is putting your customer data on a USB drive and then taking it on the bus to the data center and is going to lose it on the way. Like, not likely to be a material risk in the list of ways you could have a data breach. Obviously it could happen, but like in the grand scheme of things, not a huge risk. And so when we talk about how does it get here and why is this happening, it really is a few things kind of converging. I would say one of them is it's much easier to just add more questions. Like, oh, hey, we should cover this new thing, this new risk with AI. I'm sure you can add 20 or 30 more questions, but no one's going through and saying, do we need to ask this thing anymore? If we're using AWS or whatever cloud services, almost for sure volumes are going to be encrypted, for instance. And even if they're not, again, the actual risk that's protecting against is not really one that I personally would worry about. It's someone walking out of an AWS data center, Azure data center with a hard drive, and getting a little slice of your data. It's just not anywhere near the top list of things I would worry about, yet that features very prominently in every single questionnaire I've seen. So at some point it becomes sort of a CYA exercise of everyone's afraid to remove things because you don't want to be the person where the one bad thing happened and it's like, oh, Nate removed that question because he thought it wasn't valuable, and now look what happened. So I think that's sort of the root of how this stuff piles up. Another thing is modern distributed systems, cloud-based, you're running containers, you're doing all this stuff. It's also very technical. And I think, again, based on the questions I see, the people that are sort of sending these out don't necessarily understand all the deeper implications of, like, why is this important? What is the security implication? And that, again, makes it harder to want to remove questions because you're not probably sure what that means. And so this is where having tighter partnerships with engineering to really understand what's important, what data are we sending, what's the implication if we lose that data, how are they using that data, what does their overall system architecture look like, based on that, what should we be worried about? I mean, those are the questions that I think are much more interesting, but that takes time on the buyer side to really understand that broader context and then come up with what are the questions we should be asking that are much more targeted. Because when you do that, it also makes it much harder for the vendors to sort of give you a hand wavy answer. Because if you've given 260 questions, it's really easy to sort of just give vague answers because nobody really wants to go through 260 answers. So if you could make it whatever the reasonable number is, 20, 30, 40 questions that are very targeted to this specific use case, this specific data, the type of company we are, the type of company you are, it makes it more reasonable to expect very thorough answers, and then that gives you a much better idea of your actual risk and what that picture looks like.
Correct, Nate. I think you said two very different things for the first part of the answer and the second part of the answer. So I want to dive into that a little bit. On one hand, you're saying it's very easy for, I guess, GRC teams and security teams to come in and not remove the problem questions that they see. Is much safer for them not to touch them at all and just add to it. So you're getting legacy documents, and you made me smile when you said legacy documents from the 90s. It's often how they feel when we see them too. But then on the other hand, you're saying somebody should come in with a fresh approach with 40 new questions, start almost from scratch. Is that realistic? I mean,
Absolutely not. No one will want to take that because if you're the person pushing that, right, and you're in a big organization, Um, like basically you would be taking on all of the personal risk of if something did happen, like everyone's going to point at you as the reason no one knew about it, when realistically, even if the question did exist, odds are you were going to approve it anyway, and like it wouldn't have changed the outcome. So it really, the incentives aren't lined up. This is why the problem persists, right? The
Right.
incentive for someone to go ahead and change this and improve it, um, it's just not there. It's the incentive is to keep the status quo, because at least if something went wrong, everybody can be like, we asked about it. I don't know, like they either weren't doing it, they weren't doing it well, or they were doing it and it still happened. But hey, we did what we could. And again, that's why I say it ends up being more of a CYA practice than one to really understand the risk and make smart business decisions. Because I think people forget it's okay to take on some risk, right? Like our goal isn't to minimize risk down to zero. It's to understand what that risk is. And if there is something material, what can we do about it? But you're really unlikely to understand what that material risk is if you're not understanding the deeper context, again, of like what data you're sending, how it's being used, what their systems look like, where are the big risks on their side. And that requires, I mean, realistically, it requires a lot of knowledge of distributed systems and cloud services that probably your average person working in TPRM isn't necessarily going to have. And so how do we bridge that gap and give them tools to understand that context, to make the smarter decisions of like what should we really care about, and then how do we hold companies accountable to doing the things that they're saying they're doing.
Makes complete sense. What do those tools look like? Are they platforms? Are they larger teams? Are they better structure, better process? What does it look like for you?
And this one, I think it's going to be a mix of things. This is obviously where AI can be super helpful, because it can help whoever is doing the assessment really think through like what should we care about and why. But it does need a lot of that context to be put driven as part of whatever that tool might be. I think it would be fairly hard to just take a modern language model and just say, hey, what should I worry about? Here's the answers to this question, because it will. I mean, it's trained on the broader internet, and that has a lot of the same problems that we're talking about, right? Like it's going to be concerned about all of these things like encrypted volumes in the cloud, which again, like the server probably has a key to decrypt it. So if the server gets hacked, your data is going to get lost anyway. And you're really only protecting against hard drive theft, which probably not high in the list.
We've discussed the problem, I think, and you've given many reasons for the problems around TPRM. We're touching also on a better approach. So I want to direct you more towards where you see a better, more feasible approach and something that works day to day for I guess teams that are working hard already. They had a lot of tasks on their plate. So I guess we're talking about that practical element as well as
Mm-hmm.
the theoretical element, right? So you talked about focusing on what really matters for security in the context of a vendor. How should teams figure out what those priorities are?
I mean, it's really understanding the individual engagement, because no two are going to be alike. Are you sending personal data? Is it going to have financial data? What's that data going to be used for? How is it going to be processed? How many different systems are they sending that off to? Because now you're thinking about third and fourth party risk. How is it being protected in those cases? What are the most likely ways that that data is going to leak? Is it potentially just a mistake on a human side if it's going to get sent off somewhere and be processed? Is it that it's being connected to lots of other systems and just it's the general sprawl of data across all of these systems that's going to cause problems? There's all of the different ways that data can leak. So some of this is just for teams to be aware of, really looking at the breaches that have happened in the last 3, 4, or 5 years. Like, what are the causes of those? Because again, they're probably not the hard drive thing. It's going to be much more, did they not have multi-factor authentication for all their users? How many people have admin rights? Is it, if it's a smaller company, they're more likely that it's going to have sort of sprawling admin rights for everyone. So how is that being dealt with? How is that controlled? Is it temporary, so that people don't just permanently have admin rights to the data? Is it actually being logged? Is there any way to understand if something bad is happening? So it's really understanding the context of what you're sending, which pieces of that data are really material. Like if it was lost, this is very, very bad for us, because I think a lot of times that maybe hasn't necessarily been thought through, or people are focused on, well, anything is bad if we lose anything, when really there probably is a very small subset of that that's sort of critical, that hey, this is our IP. This is whatever it is that might, if it leaks out, is actually going to be quite bad for us as a company. So understanding what that is, where it's going, how things can go wrong, so it's kind of like a threat modeling for your vendors, so you can think through what can go wrong, and then working backwards from there. What controls would prevent that? What's most important? And then how can we make sure that that's actually happening in a way that's realistic for the vendor, given what we know about their size and maturity levels, and what are we willing to accept when it comes to risk? And some of that, again, is pushing it up the chain, that our goal is not to bring risk down to zero. Like, these vendors might get breached, and that isn't what anyone wants, but if they're adding a ton of business value and there's still some small percentage chance that that happens, that should be acceptable, and people should understand that that's part of the value we're getting of having all of this stuff, using third-party services. That's the trade-off we're making, and being just much more aware of that trade-off, as opposed to assuming that everyone in TPRM's job is to just eliminate risk and make sure we never get breached through third-party vendors, because that's not realistic.
Yeah, you're talking really clearly about understanding and accepting risk rather than eliminating it. And I think those are really critical words and language to use. So often you hear from whether it's blog posts or LinkedIn posts about the elimination of risk. And like you said, real world understanding and accepting of the risk, but understanding it critically is I think it's really important. So I just wanted to highlight that as something I think is really valuable for listeners. Um, One of the things that you leveraged in the post was procurement as a moment of power, and
Mm-hmm.
how teams can leverage that moment. We often talk about processes or tools, but here you're talking particularly about a team or a moment. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know as teams become more critical to the central part of security, this is something that I think is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this really is probably the biggest way that, as a TPRM team, you can move the needle on actually improving security. And this is why I say it's really important to just kind of focus down on what's important, because realistically, the odds are, from what I've seen, regardless of the answers, unless there's something just truly outrageously bad, it's probably going to get approved, because no one on the TPRM side wants to be the one who's constantly telling the business, you can't use any of these tools because something, this risk or that risk. It's just not. You're now blocking the business, and you'll probably be out of a job quickly if that's your answer to most things, because there's risk there. So if we instead flip it to, we know that, and again, unless there's something really, really bad, we're probably going to use this because the value is there for our business to have whatever this service is. Given that, we've looked at sort of the process, what we're sending to them, how they're using it, all of those things, and we've come up with this top 2 or 3 gaps that we think they really need to make sure they're addressing. And it could be anything. Maybe they don't have EDR running in the cloud environment, or it's not on people's laptops, or whatever you've decided the top 2 or 3 things are. I think it's really important then to go back and work with the procurement team and say, hey, we want to make sure there's a commitment that they will do this, whatever it is, 2 or 3 controls. They're going to make sure these are implemented in the next 6 months. And this is a blocker to signing. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but at least telling the vendor that, because that's the biggest point that you have any sort of leverage. You haven't signed. Now there's a sales team on the vendor side who is going to be like wanting to make sure they close this deal. And if that's tied up to having this control or that control, and those controls are reasonable and like, oh, these are things we should have, now you're much more likely to be giving resources to the vendor security team, because now sales is going to be helping the security team push for this as well. Hey, this is tied to revenue. Otherwise, it's just security people asking for things, and kind of like, usually no one wants to do any of that because it's really hard to quantify the value. This now quantifies it, because this contract is tied to implementation of these controls. So while it might seem like you're sort of being a pain to the security team at the vendor side, this is the biggest gift you can give them, is a sales team now fighting to give them resources. So I think it's really, really important to make sure you leverage that in conjunction with a procurement team of like, how do we make sure we're pushing one or two controls? Obviously, you can't give them a list of 20 things because then it's not feasible unless the contract size is huge. But if it's one or two things and there's sort of common sense controls that probably this company should have, or maybe it's things that are pushing the boundary a little bit, if they're a larger, more mature company, again, you're giving them internally that ammunition they need to actually move their security program forward. You're giving them resources by tying your contract to requirements like that.
Really interesting, especially when you're in a fast-paced role or your company is moving quickly, to know that that is the window of opportunity, especially from your perspective, is really great to remember. Um, Finally, from this part, you suggested that contractual commitments is a way of closing gaps. How do you make sure vendors actually follow through, or is that a way, do you think, of changing the process of TPRM?
I mean, you can obviously go leave a note to yourself or whatever the process ends up being to just follow up in 4 months or 6 months. And I think that's actually a good idea because there are, of course, companies who will say, just sign it. Well, they probably won't ask, which is probably true. People in TPRM or whatever are very busy. You're going to have hundreds and hundreds of vendors, and there's two of you, and you're dealing with questionnaires, and maybe you don't have time to follow up. But it would be pretty easy to just set a reminder and send an email to the team in whatever the timeline is, 4 months, 6 months. Hey, we're checking back on the contractual commitment you made. Is this ready? Can you send a little evidence about it? Not the worst idea because with many software companies, it's going to be easy to say like, hey, we'll do that. We have 6 months, and then they forget, everybody forgets, and no one ever checks up. But if it is, now you're asking about it and it was in the contract, again, you're kind of now flexing those teeth that you put in contractually, because revenue is at risk, and you're really pushing that, hey, this does matter to us. You're sending that signal, and giving those resources to the security team on the other end to make sure this gets implemented.
Really clear, and you identified two or three really clear moments where you can improve the TPRM process, and I think that's super critical on the practical side of things.
And it saves a bunch of time too, right? Because
Yeah,
you just have to send a quick message. That could be literally a 2-minute email just saying, hey, did you do this? And ideally, if you narrow down your 200x questions down to 40 or 50 that are really important, you're saving yourself time of not kind of having to go through all of these things that don't really matter.
and repeat that across hundreds of thousands of vendors. It's a game changer.
It's a move to do for your own sanity.
Absolutely. And not the first time we've heard that too. Final question, Nate, I think it's a good one to end on. If you were designing a third-party risk management process from scratch, what's the one thing you'd keep, and what's the one thing you would make sure that never makes it in the first place?
I think it's weird because it's sort of the same thing. I mean, the one thing I would try to get rid of would be, of course, the questionnaires. But at the same time, questionnaires themselves aren't bad. It's just the way that they end up in the way they are now, right? So the thing I would keep is questionnaires. The thing I would throw out is this idea that their goal is to just cover everything, and to try to make sure you have an answer about every possible thing that could go wrong. And so that really requires just a rethinking of what our goal is with these questionnaires. And it shouldn't be to try to cover every possible thing that goes wrong. It's to understand what are the really material risks that are out there to the really critical data that we're going to be sharing with this other vendor. And how do we make sure we use that to identify things that we can do, that we have leverage to do, to make the vendor make that more secure, and thereby lowering the risk. I mean, that really is our goal. So it's how do we make sure we get back to the roots of what the program is supposed to do, which is manage and ideally reduce risk and get a really clear visibility into where there is material risk. Because I think it's not through anyone's fault, but just the way things happen naturally, it sort of drifted away from that and much more into a CYA sort of posture.
Absolutely, and I just want to first of all thank you for coming on today, and secondly to say keep posting about TPRM specifically. You're a really clear and well-sounded voice on TPRM, and it's not really spoken about enough, at least across LinkedIn. So keep pushing it, please. And
Definitely.
yeah, it's just been good to chew the fat with you a little bit today, and thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I've been doing a bunch more writing on this, so certainly people should feel free to give me a follow.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Nate, and have a good day.
Thanks.